We know that phosphorus is important for plant growth. But how do plants acquire phosphorus? Specifically, what are the mechanisms for plant phosphorus accumulation and utilization? Phosphorus is one of the 3 most important nutrients in a plant's diet, alongside of nitrogen and potassium. When you buy fertilizer at the store, most of the bags will show 3 letters, NPK. This NPK score tells you how much of each nutrient is present in the fertilizer mix. This is important depending on the plant or soil you're using, so farmers and gardeners can select different fertilizer mixtures. Plant roots absorb phosphorus in the chemical form phosphate, using a group of proteins on the root surface known as phosphate transporters. Phosphate is shipped from these phosphate transporters into the root cells and loaded into the plant's vascular tissue network. Plants have 2 types of vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem. The xylem is used to acquire water and dissolved nutrients from the roots to the other parts of the plant. The phloem is used to transport food made from the leaves to other parts of the plant. Phosphate is transported throughout the xylem and shipped to specific aerial plant tissues, the leaves, flowers, fruits, seeds, etc. This is what happens to the plant when phosphate is present in the soil. How does low phosphate affect plant growth? When the soil is low in phosphate, the plant launches a series of responses known as the phosphate starvation response, or PSR. The PSR is the plant's emergency SOS response to acquire as much phosphate as possible to survive under the stressful phosphate-depleted environment. The PSR includes both physiological and molecular mechanisms. One physiological example is that plants can change the way its roots grow throughout the soil. Traditionally, plants will put energy into growing their primary root deep in the soil. When phosphate is low, they will prioritize lateral root density to increase surface area for acquiring phosphate. Another hallmark response is accumulation of anthocyanins, which give the plant leaves a purplish color. On the molecular level, the plant will increase root-to-shoot transport of phosphate, release proteins into the soil to liberate phosphate bound to molecules that were unavailable otherwise, and even cannibalize parts of their own cells by breaking off the phosphate head groups on the cell phospholipid membranes to reprioritize intracellular phosphate usage. In our next video, we will discuss the molecular mechanisms that regulate how this process works. While we as scientists have a good understanding as to how plants can adapt to soils low in phosphate on the molecular level, plant growth in environments with excessive levels of phosphate needs further examination. While this may seem obvious to study plant growth under low phosphate, given that phosphate is usually depleted in most soils, it is still important to study as there are areas where phosphate levels are excessively high. This is especially important given the fact that continuous application of manure or other fertilizers on farmland increases phosphate abundance. Studies show that when plants acquire too much phosphate, they show symptoms of phosphate toxicity. Phosphate toxicity includes and is not limited to yellowing of the leaves, also referred to as leaf tip necrosis and chlorosis, as well as stunted root growth and reproduction. Excess phosphate can also make plants deficient in other important nutrients, such as iron and zinc. It is important that we continue to study how different phosphate conditions impact plant growth so that we can create better environments for our crops, as well as crops that can survive under stressful conditions. Please watch Part 2 to learn more about the molecular mechanisms that allow plants to adapt to low phosphate conditions.